Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, still in webinar mode, co-organized by the ETUI, of which I am Director of Research. Good morning, I'm Nicola Koudouris. AKVN, OSE, but also ÖGB. We're very grateful for the support and the interest that a number of organizations and a number of individuals, many of which are going to meet in a second, have given to this initiative. Our initiative today, our webinar today, tries to explore a fundamental question that I think has been buzzing in everybody's heads over the past year, and this is the extent to which the social actors have been, social partners have been attributed greater voice in the management of Europe's macroeconomic affairs since the last crisis, in particular by reference to the operation of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And let's make no mistake, this is an important testing ground for the allegedly new Europe that is emerging or should emerge from the ashes of this terrible crisis that we've been plunged into since March 2020. In order to explore this question today, we will benefit from the presentation of two outstanding experts that are in the process of leading some major research on this particular topic, and the organizing bodies of this event, ourselves, AKVN, are benefiting from the knowledge. They have also produced some work for us. And these two outstanding experts and the co-authors of the paper and presenters, keynote presenters, are Bart van Henke, who's the director of the European Social Observatory, himself a social policy expert and also an active academic and researcher in the field, and Amy Verden, who is Jean Monnet Chair in European Social Policy and Integration at the University of Victoria. She's joining us from the University of Victoria in Canada. Don't be fooled by her background. She's currently joining us in the early hours of the morning. I think it's 1:05 a.m. Where she is. And following the presentation, which should last, I'm sorry, as the chair, I also have to deal with these things, should last approximately 20 minutes. Following their presentation, we will have three panelists that will further elaborate on some particular aspects of this important question. We have Norbert Tempel, who is a researcher in economic matters from the Austrian Chamber of Labour in Vienna, from AKVN. We have Sotiria Theodoropoulou from the European Trade Union Institute. Sotiria is our chief economist here at the ETUI. And then the following speaker would be Benoît Lallemand, who is the Secretary General of Finance Watch, and of course, Finance Watch has been watching, very closely these developments, and they have, of course, a particular interest in both involvement of social actors, of other actors as well, in the operation of this, by all means, a new facility. We will have some other interventions following that, but I will make presentations in due course. What I wanted to say is that we are benefiting from an English-German interpretation, and therefore, if you would, if you are a German speaker and you would like to listen to the translation, and we'll also have some presentations in German from Norbert. There will be translation available in English. Please go on the interpretation link, which is that at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. If you have any questions, if I can see there's an unsurprisingly high number of participants, there's more than 140 people joining. So now, if you have any questions, kindly put the questions into the Q&A box, not in the chat box. And I would be very, very happy to report the questions for you. If, of course, somebody wants to ask or make some contribution, please let me know, verbally, let me know. And I think there are technical facilities for doing that. But without further ado, I would like to give the floors to Bart and Amy, if I may. The floor is yours, and you have up to 1/2 to complete your presentation. Thank you very much. Very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicola, for your kind introductory words and for raising the expectations of indeed a large crowd here this morning. Thank you also to ETUI, ÖGB, AK EUROPA for co-organizing and co-hosting this event. I'm really quite excited to be here actually this morning. It's like back to school for me. I don't know about you, but it's my first webinar after the holidays, and so yeah, I'm really quite excited about this. I'm very happy that Amy is among us today, in spite of the nightly hour in Canada, in Victoria. But we really felt that we wanted to give this presentation together, because for those who will read the policy brief that we're about to present, and which will be available on the website during this webinar, you will see that we draw on the one hand on Amy's seminal work on economic governance, economic monetary union, etc. And on the other hand, on the work that I've been conducting, notably together with Jonathan Zeitlin, on the socialization of the European semester. And I think, well, up to you to judge whether that whether we've been able to create a synergy between our strands of work. So maybe before Amy puts the beef on the table, I just want to flag the fact that this is one of these research endeavors that started very tiny, maybe even minimalistic. Amy, you remember when we first started talking about this research, we weren't super ambitious, and then it grew as it continued, with more interviews and more text analysis, which was also possible thanks to different kinds of funding. We're happy to have Eurosem, Erasmus+, but also, of course, ETUI and AK EUROPA supporting our research endeavors. And so we're very happy that now, already at this early stage of our research, so many people are interested and willing to engage in the discussion. And maybe it's important to underline that, of course, as Nicola also already mentioned, this is really work in progress. We have by no means we'll by no means say the last word on this topic today. It's, for us really the first time that we discuss our initial findings with a larger audience. And so for us, it's also really a fact-finding webinar. So those of you who have elements to put on the table, who know of other research, who are involved in other research, by all means, jump in. Just be careful. If you say something that we really find interesting, we might end up on your doorstep for an interview. But that's the risk that you will maybe want to take. So, Amy, I guess at this stage, knowing you will be comfortable to kick this off and put some beef on the table. I'll share the slides.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, let me just add my thanks to all the organizers, and for Bart also to start us off. It's an honor for us to be able to present this work to a group of distinguished participants. We were originally also quite keen to reach out to practitioners and scholars alike. And having had a glance over the list of people here present today, I'm honored to have a lot of very distinguished guests amongst our audience. So what we wanted to do in our presentation today is to give you a highlight of some of the research that we've been doing. Bart has already indicated that it's based on research we've done through interviews with some key practitioners and people involved in the policymaking process, but also with documents. So let me take us back to a period that we've all kept a close eye on when it all came out. And this was the response by the EU to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we spoke about in the summer of 2020, and in fact in the run-up to that, following the announcement in March 2020 of the COVID-19 being a pandemic, was that the European Council agreed to unprecedented financial support to member states. And it's unprecedented in a number of ways, right? It is to help member states out with the economic fallout of the pandemic. Of course, intended to be temporary in the sense that it was focused really on this particular crisis. It was nevertheless something that a number of practitioners were concentrating on as something that might have an impact down the road. So the decision was made in the summer, in July 2020, during the European Council meeting, and it was eventually created formally after all of the procedures that are put in place in February 2021. So the Recovery and Resilience Facility itself was created in February, and what it aims to do is to set up a temporary institutional structure to support member states with loans and grants. And in order to do that, the member states need to submit national recovery and resilience plans, the NRRPs. And what we wanted to do in this presentation was to look at how this particular setup in one way or another changes the power balance in EU macroeconomic architecture among in particular key actors. So those who were involved in macroeconomic governance in the EU context are typically actors that are in the financial and economic domain, but there's also a lot of social affairs actors involved. In this chat, you will have seen that there's a policy brief that is just being launched as we speak. And we also have put a larger paper together, which is forthcoming in a special issue of the Journal of Common Market Studies. Next, please. So here I just wanted to remind you of those of you who are watching the news or checking these kinds of things out in visual form. So here's a picture that reminds you of that European Council of July 2020 platform. We also here have just a little image that we wanted to flash by on the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Some of you may have seen in the past a similar type image. For example, we talked about Jonathan Zeitlin, myself and Jonathan Zeitlin put together a special issue of JEP in 2018. We also included a slide that has the timetable of the European semester, and it's a very similar sort of showing of what happens when, and we wanted to share with you a similar image here that takes the steps that are taken in order to access the funding, the rather large 672.5 billion euro funding, and in fact corrected for inflation, this number will change with the years, so to say. Next slide, please. So our question here is how the RRF interconnects with the European semester. So one of the things that we were right away quite sort of puzzled by was that the RRF in the announcements in the summer of 2020 reaffirmed the European semester as a key vehicle to guide macroeconomic policy coordination in the EU. Now, the European Commission had already made a suggestion a couple of months earlier about maybe including the European semester, but it was not at all clear that this would be taken on board by the European Council. Obviously, the European semester has been criticized in the past for maybe not having enough bite or having mostly a bark, but then whether member states would take on board recommendations in the European semester context. So we wanted to look at how the European semester what role it played in the RRF. We also wanted to see to what extent some elements of coordination changed over time or will remain the same as we move forward. So this research is based on, as we mentioned already, extensive document analysis, but also 23 semi-structured elite interviews that we held in the period of October 2020 till July 2021. And most of them, in fact, were done with Bart and myself and the respondent together. So we were able to benefit from the online platforms that make these conversations possible. The people we spoke to included people with senior positions in different directors general of the European Commission, but also European social partner organizations and in member states. And we did not just only in this period, but also continued fact-finding in the next weeks and are happily benefiting from support from ETUI and the AK EUROPA. Next slide, please. So here we have a little funky image that shows some older pictures of Goldilocks and the three bears. This may be a story that you know from child's tales about three bears and Goldilocks coming into the house and wanting to see if there was any food for her. And she looked at the food was there, like the bowls, the hotness of the food, but also a bed that she lies in. And the image that comes back all the time is not too big, not too small, just the right size bed, just the right temperature of the porridge. So the parable of the Goldilocks we felt was interesting to think about in terms of the European semester, in part because the European semester may to some extent have been exactly in the sweet spot between being on the one hand not overly harsh, but on the other hand able to still have some restriction on member states. So we use that Goldilocks term to identify the role of the European semester in the governance modes for the recovery. And in our scholarly work, we've also focused on historical institutionalism, the way in which previous institutional setups influence the future choices available. And what we identified here was that the formative experience of the euro area crisis had an important role to play in finding the solution for the European answer to the pandemic. So there was a sense that there needed to be a bit of timing to finish the next step in a timely fashion, but also to allow member states to obtain some funds, but have still some form of conditionality for spending grant money, and that this conditionality be for all member states, independent of whether they are members of the euro. So the European semester, as I mentioned, in that sense, is maybe not too soft and not too hard, so something to build on. And one of the questions that we hope to address as we move forward is the question of whether this European semester now will be hardened. So it was usually considered a soft mode of governance without too much stick, so to say, but a lot of carrot. So if you do this, we'll give you that, but there's not too much harshness in the system. And another question we asked ourselves was whether the actors that are involved in the European semester until now will have the same roles. Next slide, please. And so the question here is, how does the integration of the RRF in the European semester change economic policy coordination? So some of the semester vehicles, instruments that have been used in the European semester had been frozen in the first period right after the pandemic occurred. So there was no so-called winter package that was normally part of the semester. The country reports have been replaced by evaluations of the NRRPs. So there's no new country-specific recommendations except for those on fiscal matters. And instead, the Commission indicated that all previous CSRs remain valid. Other semester tools have already been transformed. So, for example, the annual sustainable growth strategy became guidance for the RRFs. and the national reform programs gained salience that are coupled with the NRRPs. And some of them are being reshaped at the present time. So for example, the multilateral surveillance procedure for the moment is still on hold. Next slide, please. Okay, at this point, I'd like to invite Bart to take over our presentation and listen to what he has to say. Thank you very much for your attention so far.
Thank you, Amy, for putting the first dish on the table. So yeah, our key question, or one of the key questions we're trying to answer: have social actors been sidelined? As the slide here says, it is a question that begs a nuanced response. And I already noted on Twitter when we were disseminating, publicizing this event, that some people had very clear-cut answers. Yes, social actors have been sidelined. Well, let's see. A nuanced response is needed. Why? Mainly for two reasons. First of all, of course, because as we speak, the governance architecture of the Recovery and Resilience Fund is still being invented and implemented. All of this is still moving to some extent, and so no firm or very final conclusions are unfortunately possible at this stage. But also, and this is immediately showing to some extent the limits, of course, of our research, as there are always limits to research, namely that we have mostly looked at the involvement of institutional social players, institutional social players at the EU level. So these are two limitations to some extent. So we looked at the EBSCO Council, their advisory committees, the Employment Committee and the Social Protection Committee, also the role of DG Employment of the European Commission, the involvement of European social partners, both sides of industry, and even though with a bit of a lighter touch, Amy, the involvement of some social actors in the European Parliament, meaning that we have not looked so far, or to a very limited extent, at national level involvement, which is of course a big part of the puzzle that you would need to also look at if you want to really have an encompassing answer. But also what we haven't looked at so far is the role or the involvement of European and national NGOs. So just to nuance this from the start, a nuanced response is needed. But what have we found? So first of all, when we started this research in October, November last year, it was very clear from the initial texts that the European Commission and the Council was circulating that the management of the RF would be entrusted to the Secretary General of the European Commission, notably its Recovery and Resilience Task Force, RECOVER, but also DG ECFIN, and all this subject to control of the member states, as Amy explained, the carrots and the sticks combination. The Economic and Finance Committee, the famous or the infamous EFC, was given an important role, a backup role for the European Council, and clearly the Commission in the driving seat to steer and monitor the use of these funds. Also important, of course, at the national level, it's mostly prime ministers, finance ministers, and in a number of cases, the ministers responsible for cohesion policy that call the tune. And so, unsurprisingly, to some extent, if you look at this initial governance setup, or who were given the keys to the RF or the implementation of it, we saw and we found that social affairs players, as I defined them a minute ago, and so the more institutional social affairs players at the EU level, lost much of the access which they had gained over time during the past decade in the European semester. The employment and social affairs ministers and their committees, the SPC and EMCO, really played a marginal role in the initial months after the launch of the RF. Importantly, Social Affairs Commissioner Schmidt was and is not in the RF steering board. DG Employment, as a result, was no longer considered as a core DG, as it was the case in the European semester in the preceding years. And we saw that stakeholder involvement, which had been slowly but certainly increasing during the past years, during the semester, really went down the drain in the last year, in the last cycle of the semester, not only to ensure a speedy implementation of the RF, but also because these stakeholders, in an entirely or a largely new context, had to look for new entry points into the decision-making, and all this under very tight time constraints. So things looked quite dreary at the end of last year with regard to stakeholder or involvement of social actors, to put it more precisely, in the European semester. Now, so and this also came out very clearly in the initial round of interviews that we did last year, where there was, I would say, a little bit of panic among those people that we interviewed. But things have changed since then, and that's why I'm also saying, and we are arguing, that a nuanced account is needed. Namely, what we see is that since especially the beginning of 2021, there are indications that social players are re-emerging in the context of the RF and the semester, which are intrinsically linked and institutionally linked to each other. First of all, so it's quite clear that the EBSCO Council, the committees advising this council formation, but also DG Employment, social partners, are, with varying degrees of success, getting a foot in the door of the RF decision-making. And they're doing so, interestingly, and this is what Amy explained, that they're doing so by using pre-existing European semester tools in which they had acquired an increasingly important role, and which provides them a ready-made institutional template, but also the legitimacy and even the legal base to get a foot in the door. So just to give you a few illustrations, and you will of course read the policy brief that has been shared now, and especially you will, if you are interested in this topic, read the detail of the analysis, of the empirical analysis, in our forthcoming Journal of Common Market Studies publication. So, few illustrations. The Social Affairs Council demanded and to some extent acquired its place in the NRP implementation by strongly referring to the treaty base to do so. And this is a very exceptional move from the social affairs ministers. Secondly, after months of hesitation about what role to play in the RF, if any role, to be honest, the Employment Committee and the SPC revamped their multilateral surveillance activities, notably to ensure their input into the RF, but also to inform the social affairs ministers and also the European Commission in its assessments of the NRPs. The DG Employment, third illustration, is now in practice fully involved in the assessment of the national recovery and resilience plans, the meetings with the member states, and so on. And so the country intelligence of DG Employment is fully recognized to some extent, and through that angle is given a role in the setup and the implementation of the NRP, even though on paper it doesn't look so good. Finally, and there I'm sure that some of the participants will be able to provide us with valuable feedback. The RF regulation, and this is new compared to what we had known before in the context of the semester, the regulation requires that member states not only report on how they liaised with stakeholders, national stakeholders, which is broadly defined in the context of the writing up of the NRPs, but also they have to explain how this input has been reflected. Knowing, and we should not be naive, of course, that the actual window of opportunity for stakeholders to actually engage with these NRPs was strictly limited due to time constraints. So strategic actors, social affairs players, are in search for a place around the table. And again, this is only to some extent this is anecdotal, but it is real in its impact. We saw that many stakeholders, but also Commission, European Parliament, officials explained to us that the online meeting culture that emerged in 2020-21 further facilitated access of such consultations with social stakeholders who had access to more and higher ranking decision makers than was ever the case before, which to some extent suggests that the initial sidelining of social actors as we saw it at the end of 2020 was probably the result of crisis policy making rather than a strategic move from this or that actor to discard certain players from this new facility. In conclusion, and some points for discussion, and Nicola, I hope we are still on time. I'll be brief. Social affairs players, that's our preliminary conclusion of our research now. Their role cannot be taken for granted, and this is indeed puzzling in view of, first of all, the role they indeed had acquired during the past socialization of the European semester, but also in view of the huge amounts of social spending that is going to be involved in the NRPs. And we know, of course, that this to some extent is not such a surprise in view of the constitutional asymmetry that we are all aware of between economic and social policies in the European integration process. At the same time, so even if the social affairs players' role cannot be taken for granted, we find that the semester officers, the semester practices, the semester tools that were out there have provided and are providing opportunities and resources for strategic agency by different groups of actors. After having been sidelined very clearly in the initial months, social affairs players are gearing up, seizing their place around the table, and are moving back to adopting previous semester practices. The European semester, as we try to argue, may indeed end up being more effective in the end due to the choice to embed the RF within this soft, or as we call it, Goldilocks mode of governance. More carrots and more sticks seem to suggest that the semester, including the CSRs, in fact, will be taken more seriously, which leaves us with a bunch of questions. I don't know, Amy, which would be the most important ones for you to answer? I just want to flag one, namely, as we've seen in previous research at the European Social Observatory, the risk is, of course, that some of the social stakeholders that we are talking about, and if we would enlarge it to national trade union representatives, national business representatives, but also European and national NGOs, that they might end up again being heard at the EU level without actually being listened to, namely their voices having practical effects. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Amy, would you like to wrap this up?
Yeah, so thanks very much. I think we're almost at the end of the time given to us. So yeah, we've had put some questions for discussion, but we also know that there are some commentators and we also have a rather large audience. So yes, we're still very keen to also hear comments from you right now during our webinar today, and also reach out to us if you have some further thoughts about this and are unable to participate at this point in time. So there's a lot of questions still open for discussion, and we look forward to the following stage of our webinar today. Thank you very much for the attention.
Amy, Bart, thank you very, very much for this. It's really thought-provoking. I don't want to interrupt this excellent flow of ideas that is coming from my screen, so I will immediately pass the microphone to Norbert. I just want to say that questions are indeed starting to appear in the Q&A facility, at the bottom of the screen. Please do carry on. I will relay these questions. They're all very relevant. So you've clearly, provoked thoughts and they're starting to appear. Thank you. Norbert, the floor is yours. We can listen to Norbert either in German or translated in English.
Ja, danke schön, herzlichen Dank. Ich danke im Namen der Arbeiterkammer, dass Sie an diesem Webinar teilnehmen, und ich danke vor allem auch Bart und Emmy für diese interessante und wichtige Studie. Ich möchte in aller Kürze zwei Aspekte herausgreifen, nämlich die Qualität der Einbindung der Sozialpartner auf nationaler Ebene. Da kann ich wirklich was dazu sagen, und in Bezug auf Österreich und generell die Zukunft des europäischen Semesters im Sinne von mehr Carrots und Sticks. Zum ersten Aspekt. Der Untertitel der Studie lautet ja, sind soziale Akteure im Zusammenhang mit der Aufbau- und Resilienzfazilität ins Abseits geraten. Und da muss ich Ihnen leider berichten, für Österreich passt dieser Titel gut. Die Europäische Kommission hatte die Einbindung der Sozialpartner, auch der nationalen Sozialpartner und Stakeholder bei der Erstellung der nationalen Pläne ja ganz klar vorgesehen. Auch in der Verordnung finden sich dazu klare Aussagen. Allerdings ist also das leider bei uns in Österreich nur marginal geschehen. Wenn Sie sich anschauen, den österreichischen Aufbauplan, der umfasst über 600 Seiten, und nur 1,5 Seiten dieses Aufbauplans ist der Frage der Einbindung der Sozialpartner gewidmet. Die Kommission hat dann in ihrer Bewertung dieses Aufbauplans leider sehr unkritisch die Darstellung der Bundesregierung übernommen, dass ein umfassender Konsultationsprozess stattgefunden habe. Das stimmt leider eben mit der Realität nicht überein. In Österreich gab es statt einer offenen Diskussion eine E-Mail-Adresse zur Abgabe von Vorschlägen. Es gab nur ein einziges Gespräch mit der zuständigen Bundesministerin, das inhaltlich nicht ergiebig war, auch wenn es atmosphärisch sehr gut abgelaufen ist. Und vor allem auch die Sozialpartner haben weder den Entwurf des Plans erhalten, noch wurde ihnen Gelegenheit eingeräumt, ihre Forderungen und Vorschläge in geeigneter Form zu präsentieren. Und dabei wäre aber ausreichend Zeit gewesen, um einen breiten Begutachtungsprozess zu starten. Sie wissen ja, dass also die Mitgliedstaaten den Zeitplan seit Mitte September 2020 kannten für die Erstellung dieser Aufbaupläne, dass die ersten Entwürfe bereits im Oktober übermittelt hätten werden können. Und wir haben als Arbeiterkammer bereits im Dezember 2020 konkrete Vorschläge an die Bundesregierung übermittelt, aber es gab keine inhaltliche Auseinandersetzung mit unseren Vorschlägen. Im Gegensatz zur Europäischen Kommission, muss ich es sehr lobend hervorheben, werden wir unsere Vorschläge auch nach Brüssel übermittelt und wurden eingeladen zu einem Gespräch mit der Taskforce Aufbau und Resilienz. So etwas hätten wir uns auch von der Bundesregierung erwartet. Es wäre jedenfalls genug Zeit gewesen, hier einen Aufbauplan gemeinsam zu erarbeiten. Es zeigt ja auch eine Untersuchung des Europäischen Wirtschafts- und Sozialausschusses, dass also bei vielen anderen Staaten diese Einbindung sehr, sehr mangelhaft abgelaufen ist. Und andererseits gibt es aber auch Beispiele, wo das sehr gut gelungen ist. Zum Beispiel Spanien und Portugal, wo der nationale Erstellungsprozess mit hoher Stakeholderbeteiligung früh gestartet wurde und wo man sich wirklich sehr, sehr aktiv einbringen konnte. Ich denke, hier könnte man die Verordnung nachschärfen. Also klare Aussagen in der Verordnung reichen eben nicht. Ich komme zum zweiten Aspekt. Zur Zukunft des europäischen Semesters, zur Frage, ob dieses europäische Semester nun gehärtet worden ist, verstärkt worden ist im Sinne von Zuckerbrot und Peitsche. Ich möchte vorausschicken, der Wiederaufbaufonds ist ein ganz, ganz wichtiger Meilenstein in der europäischen Integration aus unserer Sicht. Ganz wichtig. Man kann stolz darauf sein, dass uns das gelungen ist. Aber die Einbettung in das europäische Semester birgt eine Gefahr. Ich weiß nicht, ob Sie sich noch an den März 2013 erinnern, an die Mitteilung der Kommission zur Einführung eines Instruments für Konvergenz und Wettbewerbsfähigkeit. Die Europäische Kommission hat damals vorgeschlagen, dass sich Mitgliedstaaten auf Basis der länderspezifischen Empfehlungen im Rahmen des europäischen Semesters zu Reformen verpflichten. Und dafür gibt es dann eine finanzielle Unterstützung. Das war schon damals, muss man sagen, ein intelligenter Versuch der Kommission, die zahnlosen länderspezifischen Empfehlungen aufzuwerten, indem sie in verbindliche vertragliche Vereinbarungen eingebettet werden. Wir haben damals massiv dagegen angekämpft, auch aus dem Wissen heraus, wie stark die Strukturreformdebatte neoliberal, zumindest in der damaligen Zeit, geprägt war und zum Teil dann auch immer ist. Und so etwas Ähnliches haben wir jetzt mit dieser sehr interessanten Architektur des Aufbaufonds und Einbettung des europäischen Semesters. Mit dem Unterschied, dass es nicht nur um Reformen geht, bis bei diesen sogenannten Wettbewerbspakten ging es nicht nur um Reformen, sondern auch um Investitionen in den ökologischen und digitalen Wandel, in den sozialen Zusammenhalt. Und das ist natürlich sehr positiv. Und es ist sehr gut, dass es bei den Investitionen einen Kontrollmechanismus gibt, dass hier die Auszahlungen an Etappenziele gekoppelt sind. Das ist absolut zu begrüßen. Aber bei den Reformen ist das kritisch zu sehen. Tatsache ist, dass also die Kommission jetzt mit diesem Aufbaufonds, mit dieser Architektur eine Möglichkeit hat, auch bei jenen Mitgliedstaaten stärker in die nationale Politikgestaltung einzugreifen, die bisher nicht einer strikteren Kontrolle unterlagen, weil sie zum Beispiel in keinem Defizitverfahren unterliegen, weil sie keine EU-Finanzhilfen aus dem Stabilitätsmechanismus erhalten oder auch aus anderen Gründen. Und das ist jetzt eben gelungen. Sie kennen ja die Architektur der Aufbaupläne. Das Geld fließt nur in Tranchen. Beim österreichischen Aufbauplan haben wir so 5 Tranchen. Die erste Tranche umfasst 804 Millionen Euro. Österreich bekommt ja insgesamt 3,5 Milliarden. Und jede Tranche besteht aus Reformen und Investitionen mit vereinbarten Etappenzielen und Zielwerten. Geld fließt nur, wenn diese Etappenziele erfüllt sind. Konkret, eine nicht umgesetzte Reform könnte dazu führen, dass die ganze Tranche nicht ausgezahlt wird. Ja, also das ist schon etwas, was mir Bauchweh bereitet. Und natürlich auch ist diese Architektur so gestaltet, dass für die Dauer des Aufbauplans auch zukünftige Regierungen an die im Aufbauplan enthaltenen Reformen gebunden sind. Also sonst fließt kein Geld. Also man kann das nicht mehr ändern, wenn eine neue Regierung der Auffassung ist, also da gibt es also diese Reform ist eigentlich nicht sinnvoll. Das hat also schon eine neue Qualität und bedeutet einen Machtzuwachs für die Kommission. Dabei bin ich nicht besorgt, was die aktuelle Kommission anbetrifft. Im Gegenteil, ich sage das ganz offen und ehrlich, aus meiner Sicht ist die aktuelle Kommission die fortschrittlichste Kommission, die wir je hatten. Nehmen Sie den Grünen Deal. Die Kommission hat damit eine Dynamik in Richtung Klimaneutralität ausgelöst, die Hoffnung gibt, dass wir die Klimakrise noch bewältigen können. Die EU wird zu einem globalen Hoffnungsträger und das ist etwas, was für mich besonders wichtig ist. Aber wir wissen ja nicht, wie die zukünftige Kommission agieren werden. Wir wissen nicht, wie die länderspezifischen Empfehlungen zukünftig aussehen werden. Wir sind ja in die Erstellung nicht wirklich eingebunden. Wir müssen ganz dringend das europäische Semester daher reformieren und vor allem demokratisieren. Daher nur 3 Punkte dazu. Das Europäische Parlament muss aus unserer Sicht in allen Bereichen des europäischen Semesters mitentscheiden können, auch bei den länderspezifischen Empfehlungen. Die sozialen Akteure in der Kommission und im Rat, das ist heute ja auch schon angesprochen worden von Bart und Emi, müssen institutionell aufgewertet werden, auch die Sozialpartner. Also dieses institutionelle Ungleichgewicht zwischen den Kommissaren muss bereinigt werden, muss ausgeglichen werden. Und ganz wichtig auch, um dem Ganzen einen neuen Drive zu geben, dem europäischen Semester, nachhaltige Entwicklung von Wohlstand und Wohlergehen muss als übergeordnetes Ziel im europäischen Semester verankert werden. Dann haben wir nämlich eine ganz andere Politik. Der Jahreswachstumsbericht, wie er eben früher geheißen hat, sollte ja zu einem Jahreswohlstandsbericht weiterentwickelt werden. Also das sind so einige Punkte, wo wir glauben, da muss auch viel passieren und da brauchen wir eine ganz ernsthafte Diskussion. Die gibt es ja auch. Und noch zum Abschluss, ich muss das anbringen, wir brauchen auch ganz dringend eine Reform der Fiskalregeln. Ich bin aber sehr optimistisch, dass der Druck der Klimakrise zu Änderungen führen wird. Wir haben jetzt ein Reformfenster bis Ende 2022. Bis dahin ist der Stabilitäts- und Wachstumspakt außer Kraft gesetzt. Diese Zeit müssen wir nutzen, um den Stabilitätspakt zu einem Klimapakt zu machen. Wir brauchen so etwas wie eine goldene Investitionsregel für den grünen Deal. Denn ohne eine massive Ausweitung des budgetären Spielraums für öffentliche Investitionen werden wir die Ziele des Grünen Deals nicht erreichen können und damit auch keinen sozial gerechten Übergang zur Klimaneutralität. Damit möchte ich jetzt vorerst einmal enden, gebe das Wort weiter und danke für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
Thank you very much, Norbert, both sobering and visionary, which is, I think, exactly what we need in respect of these developments. Sotiria, I should say, has been working on this very topic fairly systematically here at the ETUI for the past few months. So she's really one of our key experts within the Institute on the operation, potential and shortcomings of the RRF. Sotiria, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Nicola, and thank you to the colleagues in Arbeitskammer Wien, the Observatoire Social Européen, the ÖGB, and the ETUI for inviting me to intervene in this webinar. And thanks also to Bart and Amy for this very interesting presentation on what is a very important question. The authors' research so far suggests that the jury is still out on whether social actors have been sidelined or not. So in the few minutes that I have for my intervention, I will try to reflect on some of the issues they raised. So I have 4 remarks. I will not mention them in the order of their importance, more like in the order they appeared in the text. A first remark is related to policy making under crisis condition. The authors found that social actors were actually sidelined in the early stages of setting up the RRF and the drafting of the National Recovery and Resilience Plans, because EU actors and national governments were acting under what they called crisis policy making conditions, needing to channel the money to the member states fast, and I quote from the policy brief, uphold the consistency in the key messages from the EU. I find this quite an ominous finding. In fact, reminding me of instances earlier in the 2010 decade in Greece, when economic adjustment programs were applied there, where, for example, there was a time when some substantial wage cuts were decided between the government and the Troika. Whether they were right or wrong is not the point here, but because the social partners could not reach an agreement fast enough, these cuts were applied from above, and this was again another crisis situation. So I think it is an ominous finding because in the last, during the summer, and for a long time now, we have had various experts, some of them produced last summer, the IPCC report on climate change, suggesting that from now until at least 2050, we're very likely to be facing critical events, crisis, whether climate or public health related. So I'm just thinking that if every time we need to take measures fast, we have to exclude social actors and, more broadly speaking, wider participation in policy making, then we are likely to end up in dangerous territory. So the question for me is, what would it take to improve policy making processes to allow for wider participation under high pressure conditions, but also the institutional capacity of policymakers and of those actors aiming at influencing policy to react fast in such critical situations so that urgency does not end up compromising participation to the extent that we have been seeing. That was my first point. My second point is, as the author suggests, the assessments of the European Commission are not going to be apolitical. They will produce consequences, distributional consequences at the national level, for which the Commission will not be held accountable because it's not subject to elections. I would think that for that reason, the European Commission will need to build political legitimacy. And this is why I would think, on a positive note, that we could expect that it promotes the participation of social actors at the EU and the national levels as a means of lending it that kind of legitimacy. Whether, however, the European Commission can be effective in getting social actors to be listened to and not just heard is an open question. My third point is that the extent to which national social actors will get to be heard at the national level and listened to is likely to vary widely across member states, depending on the actor's capacity to mobilize, to put vetoes, but also on the strength and partisan color of governments in office. To take insights from another literature, we have seen in the 25 years or so that several governments across Europe have managed to push through liberalizing labor market reforms, in many cases without trade union support or against their consent. The RRF is aiming at shifting the socioeconomic paradigm to a carbon neutral one. And for that, it is bound to produce winners, but also many losers, like labor market reforms of the sort that I mentioned did. Therefore, the answer to the question of whether social actors will be sidelined at the national level is likely to be very diverse. And one would have to wonder whether, given how fundamental the shift in the economic model towards carbon neutrality that the RRF is seeking to engineer, a wide variation in the involvement of national social actors may actually have spillover effects across member states. My final point then is related to the puzzle that Bart and Amy mentioned in the conclusions of their presentation, that despite the large sums that could be spent on social investment and reforms, social actors have been excluded from the first stages, at least, of implementing the RRF. And the one possible explanation they provide is the constitutional asymmetry. But at this point, I will also have to wonder whether a shift in ideas may explain to some extent what we see. And when I talk about a shift of ideas, it seems that issues such as the perils of large socioeconomic inequalities and the need to reduce poverty have become more salient even among economic actors in Europe, and especially in Brussels. I think it's still an open question whether this salience goes deep enough to provide policy recommendations that would really make a meaningful contribution to resolving these issues, or whether economic actors are just paying lip service, because there seemed to be quite a big backlash in the middle of the previous decade in the aftermath of the crisis and how they were dealt in Europe. However, at least at the discursive level, we can see that such questions are no longer pushed exclusively by social actors. So I would wonder whether economic actors feel that they are ticking the boxes of attempting to tackle social issues through the policies that they are in charge of, and that makes them feel less pressurized to include social actors in the management or the RRF, even though, as we saw from the results in the policy brief, they do rely on DG Employment for their knowledge in order to get intelligence about labor market and social issues. So with this, I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Soteria. Excellent comments and insights. Benoit, the floor is yours. If you could keep it within the allocated 5, 6, 7 minutes, when we have, it will give us half an hour to continue our conversation. We have received several extremely pertinent questions. I'm now very curious to hear the answers to these questions, if there are answers. Thank you, Benoit.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. I want to thank our loyal Finance Watch member, AK EUROPA, for having us on this panel, and indeed for taking the initiative of the study and of this event. I'm also delighted to see this such interest from and such a large audience. I think the issue at stake seems technical. It seems to be about boring EU policy and governance issues, and I think it's really not. I think this discussion is highly political, and in fact maybe crucial to EU politics going forward, and crucial certainly to the lives of EU citizens. I am aware I stand between the panel and what we all hope will be a lively discussion, so I'll be pretty short. I just want to, before I go in, and I express myself as a practitioner, as I'll explain, I think as a complement to social actors, strictly speaking, and unions. which we also work with a lot. I'll talk about civil society at large, NGOs, think tanks, etc., and what we've been doing and what has been our experience. But again, just taking a step back before we go in, hopefully we stand at a crucial moment in time, and hopefully we're moving from this firefighting phase, which you mentioned in the study, where a lot of the process have been, fast-tracked and rushed because of the urgency, and we gradually move into more what I'd call an architect phase, where we've saved the economy, we've saved employments, and now what? There's been a fire, it's been a pandemic, but these such fires have been raging all over the place even before COVID hit, and so now what lessons do we draw, and how do we rebuild the house in a longer term view? And hopefully at the same time we take this opportunity to implement this shift in economic paradigm, putting social justice and environmental sustainability first, and then organizing the economy around these goals, versus the approach which has been prevalent for the last 2 or 3 decades, where we'll stick to a sort of ideological paradigm where the economy comes first, whatever that means, and then we'll pay lip services to social objectives and environmental justice. So I think this is a key moment. So this discussion is very topical. I also think that there are major opportunities looking forward to the next few weeks to change the dynamics that have been described in favor of more involvement from social actors and civil society at large. So, very quickly, when I say practitioner, we've been busy as Finance Watch, but also with many partners. I'll mention a few: AK EUROPA for sure, ETUC, European Trade Union Confederation, the European Environmental Bureau, the European Youth Federation, Climate Action Network Europe, the ZOA Institute, but also people at national level. I can't mention them all because the list would be too long. We've been trying for the last 15 months to engage first on the drafting of the Recovery and Resilience Facility regulation, and then on the drafting of the national recovery and resilience plans at the national level. And now we're turning our attention to the crucial review of the economic governance. I don't think it's been mentioned yet, but I think we should discuss it. There's, together with this move from a firefighting stage to an architect phase, there is the review of the economic governance, which is coming back. As we all know, it was foreseen before COVID hit. It was put on hold, and a public debate should be reopened by the Commission in the coming days as to how to reform the way we govern the economy in Europe, economic coordination, the role of the semester, the crucial fiscal rules, etc. In fact, I'll mention it later, but we will be hosting a week, including with AK Europa, starting the week of 27 September, a week of debate around the review of the fiscal rules, etc. So one thing I want to throw in is that from a civil society perspective, we haven't been organized in the past around fiscal issues. That I first want to put this out there. And you mentioned in the study, there was only a very short period of time for civil society and civil actors to get organized national level and European level. And it's also because, somewhat strangely, there hasn't been a lot of campaigns around fiscal policy. Maybe it is because the economic paradigm of the last 30 years has been about, markets will save the day, government should play a lower role. And so for some reason, NGOs haven't been engaging much on fiscal policy. Again, this should be a turning point. There's a major return of fiscal policy, as we know, the last few months, and we should seize the opportunity to engage. 2 or 3 points before I finish. I think, as I said, the good news is this debate in a way is only starting. So we have the national recovery plans, they've been voted, but it's really the implementation that counts, and the implementation is only starting. So how do we get organized to be more involved in the process? And again, as I said, there'll be a public debate, hopefully at national level, certainly at EU level, about the future of the economic governance and the fiscal rules. And so these are opportunities to engage. I think 1 or 2 additional points has been mentioned by some, and in a nutshell, I think our governments haven't been up to the task the last few months, to be really honest. So we had a campaign called Rethink the Recovery, and the reason is we think efforts by national governments have been much more about precisely recovery and much less about resilience. So basically, we think we are missing a crucial opportunity to shift the economic paradigm. And there's a risk that we're rushing back to normal, which would really be rushing back into the next crisis, right? Environmental, social, health, which might be around the corner if we don't draw the lessons from this crisis. And so I think because national governments haven't been up to the task, I don't think they're looking to create more accountability. And I don't think they're looking for more engagements from civil society, because again, that's not in their advantage. So I have to say, it's been said, I think the Parliament has been very supportive of more stakeholder engagement. The Commission as well, of course, the European Economic and Social Committee, and by the way, both the EP and the ESC are patrons of our week of debate, 27th of September. I think it's on the council level and the level of the member states that basically I think there's still a reluctance to engage civil society actors, and I think this is one of the things we should be discussing now. How do we seize this crucial moment and this opportunity to weigh in the debate and avoid that we, as I said, rush back to normal, and on the contrary, seize the opportunity for this transformation. I'll leave it there, and I hope we can discuss these issues with the discussion in a second.
Thank you very much, Benoit. Indeed, I think that's something that we mentioned at the start. You know, this is an important test for the Europe we want. And if we fail this test, then what's next? But before I start, well, I try my best to summarize the many questions that you have received. I wanted to give the floor very quickly to Judith Feuerbach, who is a member of the Austrian Chamber of Labour, but she's also a member of the European Social and Economic Committee. And in that capacity, she has a number of insights on this very topic that she's willing very quickly to share with us. Judith, thank you very much. And you have our attention. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor and for the kind introduction, and above all for your very important work and your so interesting presentation. I try to be very brief. I think Next Generation EU is a big step forward to the integration of the European Union, and that is welcome. Even more, it is so important that we tackle the shortcomings. And from my perspective, the shortcomings, at first, yes, we talk about it, is the missing involvement of civil society and social partners. And in the beginning of the year, the European Economic and Social Committee adopted a resolution where, with the result that they have been formally involved, but with only a small impact on the plans, and this was in the drafting process, and now we do an update where we concentrate on the implementation process, and this resolution will be adopted in the beginning of the next year. Norbert Tempel also very rightly pointed to the enhanced importance of the country-specific recommendations, and also my impression is that there is an attitude, especially put forward from the employer side. They say that yes, member states get some money from the European Union, and now they should also implement the demanded structural reforms, but without saying what they mean exactly by structural reforms. However, there is another shortcoming is the social dimension is embedded in the Next Generation EU, but very unclear. And my final comment is, yes, reform of the European semester is urgently needed. And in doing so, maybe we should also remember that RRF, Next Generation EU, is part of the multi-annual financial framework. And there we have cohesion policy. And within cohesion policy, we have a very well elaborated social dimension, and also the involvement of stakeholders, of social social partners, of civil society, and so on. Just for example, what we call partnership principle. That was from my side, and yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Judith. I would like to try to build some threads between the questions that we have received. There's quite a few of them. There's clearly one thread that was initiated by Andreas Brieger from the ÖGB. I can see the question here, but it has continued in a number of other questions. And I'm paraphrasing the question that Andreas first raised. And it's, I think, the following. There is a certain agreement that consultation and engagement with social partners has been thin, ranging from lip service consultation. We even heard from some of you that Norbert mentioned that the Commission was in perhaps greater listening mode, that some member states that in theory were expected to consult under the regulations and the annexes to the regulations. So how are we going to take this forward? I mean, I have to say, personally, I'm troubled by the fact that we seem to be reconciled with the idea that the best possible word here is the fallback provision of the European semester. We've been criticizing it for the past decade or two. Clearly, one would expect more than just that. And that is something that is coming in a number of the questions. So how can we improve on this? Is it down to monitoring? Is it down to lamenting? Is it down to initiatives such as this one, simply tackling and raising the issue? May I ask to begin with our two key speakers to try to engage with this question?
Thank you. Bart, shall I just say a few words on this? So let me first thank everybody for their contributions and interventions in various modes and the lively Q&A that we also see coming by. I think some of the themes that are coming through is this sort of twofold dimension of what we've been talking about and what our discussants have also highlighted. And it's on the one hand, this phenomenon of to democratize the European semester. So as more money is being spent through this vehicle, there's a stronger feeling that one needs to improve the architecture of macroeconomic governance. And some have also highlighted the economic governance review that's happening right now, and the fact that when we talked about these soft carrots and sticks, there's also a harder side in the Stability and Growth Pact. So that there are different things here that make us realize that within the whole edifice of the EU, we have some elements that are more sort of consultation and softer, but also a potential hardening. And I think the question around this democratization is, how do we envisage being sure that the people are being heard, but also that if the governance that comes out of it is dissatisfactory, that there's a way to kick that back. Right? People have been mentioning that the Commission won't be sacked over this because it's in theory still an apolitical process, the way it's set up in the structure. So I think one of the advice that has been coming out of this research project, but also some of the speakers have highlighted, is to ensure that we do have those mechanisms that give that legitimacy to the process. So a strong role for the European Parliament is crucial. Civil society needs to be heard through these processes, but also outside of the process. So outside of formal places of having an influence on the plans, to also speak. So I think that's one element of it. And the other element of it is to make sure that there is now, as we're coming into the less crisis mode, there is back a bit more time and space, and that needs to be cherished and used very well. There was also a question about what happens if we have a crisis again. I hope that we'll be able to include more social actors as like speedy crisis moment happens. But right now we're in that next stage where we are able to include a bit more the social players and not just be in crisis mode. And I think we are, what we have learned from the European semester mechanism is that setting up an institutional structure where there is space for players is a good development. And as we mentioned, there is now a bit more language around requiring how the interaction with social players has taken place, and also to use that space as much as possible. In some member states, it means maybe also strengthening the social infrastructure of the partners, which in some countries is simply better developed than in other countries. So that might be an opportunity for some member states. So those are some of my comments, which I wanted to keep brief, and I'll pass the floor on to Bart.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you, Nicola, for introducing the debate. Thanks for all these comments. Unfortunately, we won't have time to of course, dive into all of them. Thank you for the panelists who provided such a nice agenda. Valentina, thanks for sharing this this piece of research that you did with Fintan Farrell. We will definitely include it in the follow-up research that we are conducting. So maybe a few points that I want to flag. So there is a comment by Vanya Putati, which links up to what Karen Helveg Peterson is writing about the allocation of the RF. Indeed, we didn't talk about that in this in our policy brief for today, but it is clear, and indeed that as opposed to the digital aspect and the environmental aspect, there is no earmarking for social expenditure in the NRPs in the RF. Which decreases to some extent the conditionality that the European Commission can impose on social investment reforms in this field, etc., and which also introduces, in our view, this notion of social expenditure in the RF. And I agree with Vanya Putati that it's not entirely clear what the Commission is going to do with it. So apparently there will be some kind of monitoring of social expenditure in the context of the RF. There is a mention of a methodology that needs to be developed, and we should, I think, also trade union organizations and NGOs should watch this very carefully and see what the European Commission is going to do with the scrutiny of social expenditure, because I am a little bit worried about that. But we'll get back to that once we know how this will work. And then Fernando Roja mentions also the issue of conditionality. The truth is, and this is, we discussed this more elaborately in our JCMS paper, that the jury is still out whether this new RF setup will really enhance the power of the Commission to use the sticks more severely than before. We have some anecdotal evidence, Amy. I remember from the interviews where a Commission official said, well, you know, the gender equality dimension was completely missing in that or that NRP, and so it was sent back to the member state to redo their homework. The rule of law, we know that 2 of the NRPs are being stopped by the Commission because of the rule of law issue. And we can imagine, and we have some anecdotal evidence, but not very systematic, that if the European Pillar of Social Rights, which is so clear and so present in the RF regulation, thanks to the European Parliament, by the way, that some member states had to redo their homework. And at the same time, we don't want to be naive. In the end, of course, the member states have a very heavy weight in determining what will be in their investments and reform. So the role of conditionality, we'll have to see in a few months from now how this works out. And then a third comment, Slavina Spasova from the OSE asked about multilateral surveillance. These are these ongoing peer reviews between an exchange of best practices, good practices between member states in the context of the European semester. This multilateral surveillance feeds into the CSRs, and in fact, the only way for member states to be able to change the content of the CSR substantively is when they can make a strong point already during the multilateral surveillance. So this is a very important mechanism of the semester. And so what we see now is that after a lot of hesitation whether they would even continue this, because, well, what's the point of doing multilateral surveillance on CSRs if there are no new CSRs? Now these committees are rediscovering this multilateral surveillance and using it to try to influence the RF and especially the implementation of the NRPs, including, and that's interesting, the spending side of it, which is indeed interesting because neither the MCO nor the SPC, of course, have ever been created to monitor spending by member states. So there are some interesting developments there. Then a comment from Rita Bata and also from the OSE. You refer to consultancy firms being involved by the European Commission in the assessments of these plans. I have some doubts there, but I would be very happy to look into that. So we would be happy to have the link of that article that you refer to, because, well, we know that the country desks of the Commission in different DGs, of course, they have quite a strong country intelligence. They're being supported by very good academic networks, etc. So do consultancy firms really play an important role? I have no idea, to be honest. We don't have any evidence. By contrast, what we do have evidence that links to your question, Rita, is that some people have suggested that due to the very short time span that national social actors, including and notably trade unions, business and NGOs, had to intervene in the writing of the NRPs, that lobby organizations, big business, has been able to increase its influence on those plans. Again, this is anecdotal, but I think we really need to watch out for this. And then final comment, Vincenzo left a comment about what will happen next with the CSRs, DRF. What we find in our interviews, Amy, I think, is that a few months ago, many of the actors were a little bit panicking that, you know, the semester would be on hold for several years. What we now see is that there is a big push and a lot of pressure to revisit, to get back to usual semester practices as quickly as possible. There are some commission participants in this audience. I know we're still 135 of us. If somebody would like to comment on this aspect, then that would be very good. Very quickly, Andreas Brieger, and then I really stop here, Nicola. Andreas Brieger made a point, made a very strong point about the fact that national stakeholders have not been involved in the NRPs. I would like to nuance that. I think Sotiria is right to say that there is a very big variation across member states, also depending, of course, on their national industrial relations systems and other traditions of stakeholder involvement. Ricardo Rodriguez from Eurofound also said, yeah, that the evidence that Eurofound has on this issue is also doesn't lead to a lot of optimism, but some nuance is needed because of the variation between member states. And I think the only thing that the EU really can do is to push further for exchange of good practices, peer review about stakeholder involvement in the semester, so that at least there is some pressure on those who involve their social partners in a very lukewarm way. Because let's be honest, even though I'm in favor, a regulatory framework about stakeholder involvement will be unacceptable both for business and for the vast majority of member states. Thank you.
Amy, that was extremely comprehensive, and it also relieved me of the duty of chasing you with follow-up questions from the interesting threads had developed. But I have one question that I would like to ask myself, and it's about really the future. It's about the prospects of for a serious debate about the future of economic governance. And I'm a bit troubled. I think there is a contradiction in what we are discussing here. On the one hand, we agreed that you know, the RRF mechanism has not really fulfilled its potential in terms of consultation. We are almost saying, correct me if I'm wrong, that at best we can now aspire to this type of consultation to reflect old practices that with great difficulty the social actors managed to develop in the interstitial dimensions of the semester. On the other hand, we are also saying that we want a macroeconomic reform. We want to move beyond the European semester arrangements. We want to have more meaningful levels of consultation. Benoit mentioned and put it quite forcefully, we want to have consultation involving different, a wider range of actors, certainly the social actors. In the threads of the questions, there were references to, well, what about the European social partners? What about subnational, regional actors? So there are some fundamental questions about, you know, if this has not achieved its full potential, and if this is really the most progressive commission that we've had in a long time, admittedly, how can we concentrate our energies in order to really have something different in the economic reform, macroeconomic reform debate that is and will be taking place in the conference, for instance. My fear is that we are a bit, so there is the way, but not the will. That's my fear. And I was wondering whether you could perhaps comment on this, whether this is in a way a sort of unfulfilled experience of consultation that doesn't promise anything good in terms of future reform of economic governance, and we really need to gather our energies again to get something out of it.
Bart, shall I go again first? So thank you very much, Nicola. I think you're really asking us to think forward. And I think that's, in light of some of the comments we also received, very important. I think one of the things that are still like homework that we still need to do collectively is think about the future of economic and monetary union of the EU. If we compare a federal state, you know, some of the countries in the EU are federal with different layers of government having significant responsibilities. If we compare the EU to federal state, there is not at this point that degree of transfer that is leveled, that has been happening at the EU level, that could be the equivalent of sort of economic and monetary governance, right? So if the monetary responsibilities at the level of the European Central Bank, but the fiscal responsibility remains with member states. And it is at these points that we find this sort of imbalance between the two responsibilities very salient. Now, there isn't an obvious solution. If it were super obvious, we would say, okay, why don't we just transfer the whole thing to the EU level, and then we up the level of responsibility at the EU level, including the role of the European Parliament, that we can also sack a commission or an equivalent if we are going to be really federal about this. But not all of the citizens feel really connected at that level. Most citizens feel more connected to the national level. So they would like that consultation and the amount of spending to be remaining at the member state level. And when I think about these things, I ask myself the question, is that still the right place? Is it still the right thing to do to concentrate that much on fiscal spending at the member state level? And I don't have the answer. So a part of me says, I think we need to do more at the European level. Part of me says, but if we don't have the citizen connectivity with the EU level, then that might be a theoretical jump that is worthwhile, but maybe in practice not. And I think what it requires, therefore, is that citizens, and with that, therefore, civil society organizations, but also the media, need to remain super interested in what happens at the EU level, because it is expanding that public debate at the EU level that will provide some of the baseline that we need in order for these checks and balances to work very well at the EU level. So I think in part, we're looking at this incomplete integration, but we need also civil society, social players, media, education to kind of enhance our interest and focus on the debates at the European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amy, there are echoes of the European polity dream of Habermas in what you're saying. But do you have any thoughts in terms of how we could push this forward? And Amy is correct, there are some fundamental constitutional and political constraints. You alluded to the political constraints yourself in terms of what will be politically palatable.
Very difficult question, Nicola. I'm afraid I don't have a ready-made answer. So I'll just take it home, I think. It will be one of the things that we'll have to think of, and I'd be happy to do that together. If I can be slightly provocative, I see in the chat a comment from Karen Helvig-Peterson. I don't know what or who she represents, apart from her own opinion, of course, which says that to a large extent, social actors have also abandoned their responsibility, many reflecting that this is hopeless anyway. Of course, it's a very short statement. I don't know exactly what it means, but if I can provocatively confirm that this is partly true. So indeed, social stakeholders are looking for a place in this whole arrangement, which will have very important consequences indeed for trade unions, for business in the setup of future economic governance. And I can't help noticing that indeed for many years, and for very good reasons, which I understand, politically, strategically, etc., European social partners have been very hesitant to engage in the European semester. I mean, like 6-7 years into the semester, I for example, I participated in an important meeting of some European social partners, or name them, to explain like what is this whole semester about, and maybe it's better that we just don't provide any input, because then it will go away. No, it didn't go away. It became stronger, and it became even more important. Now it's linked to huge amounts of funding. So I think so we should indeed reflect about the institutional possibilities, and also about the need for European social partners to, to some extent, to wake up and to take this as indeed an increasingly important tool and instrument, which also involves some risks. And I completely agree with what Amy said, the fact that the Commission is now intervening under the skin of the member states with regard to huge amounts of funding, reforms, investments, pushing to some extent certain reforms, and therefore, as Sotiria said, it's not neutral at all. It's they're pushing some investments and reforms, and thereby pushing some others off the agenda, whereas the Commission, the EU level, cannot really take credit or responsibility for it. So this is a very tricky issue. I couldn't help noticing also in the chat, Nicola, that following the comments or the article that Rita Baten from the OZ shared about the influence of the Big Four, there is a comment from Ricardo Rodriguez, a good colleague and friend at Eurofound, who confirms that at national level, the public-private partnership, PPP approach, needed to spend such amounts of money in a short period of time, particularly in some key actions, reforms and investments, has led to significant influence of large companies and big four consultancies in the elaboration of the NRP. So there seems to be something out there that we really need to look at, and this I find very worrying, linked to what I suggested before, that apparently, as some interviews have, respondents have mentioned to us, that big companies that lobby organizations, in view of the short time span that was available, the need to spend this money very quickly, the complexity of coming up with good economic and social investment, have really had an enormous foot between the door. And I think that this is hugely problematic and should be followed up also by social partners from a very close angle. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Bart. Thank you very much, Amy. I think this is perhaps an opposite time to bring this fascinating event to a closure. And we can do this by, we have here an interesting reminder from Benoit. Thank you very much indeed. We will be tuning in, listening carefully. Thank you all. Thank you to our keynote speakers for the work that they have been doing, I should say, because I'm privy to that, for months in order to organize this seminar today. I would also like to thank our comrades from AK Wien, our colleagues who are here today. Thank you all. This has been extremely useful and extremely timely and topical. Thank you all, and see you soon. Thank you.